I moved to the small town of Briar Hollow, Pennsylvania, a few months ago. It seemed like the perfect place to start over, quaint, peaceful, with a population that barely scraped 1,000. But there was something about the town that felt off. Something that gnawed at me in the quiet hours of the night when the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest whispers. My new neighbors were friendly enough, but whenever I tried to ask about the town's history or the dense woods that loomed at the edge of town, their expressions would shift, tight-lipped, nervous, almost as if they were hiding something. No one would ever give me a straight answer. They'd just change the subject or walk away, as if discussing it would bring some unspoken horror to life. One evening, I decided to take a walk in those very woods. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. I had always been drawn to the wilderness, the solitude it provided, but these woods were different. The further I went, the more the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. I remember pausing by a large oak tree, its bark rough and gnarled. That's when I noticed it, a small weathered sign half buried in the undergrowth. The words were faded, but I could just make them out. Do not enter after dark. A chill ran down my spine. I glanced around, suddenly aware of how still the woods had become. The usual sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, chirping crickets, had vanished. It was as if the very air was holding its breath. I should have turned back then, but something urged me to press on. The path before me seemed to stretch on forever, the trees growing denser, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out the last remnants of daylight. And then, I saw it. A faint glow in the distance, like a lantern's light, flickering through the trees. I followed it, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. As I drew closer, the light grew brighter until I stepped into a small clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated cabin, its windows shattered, the door hanging off its hinges. But it was the light that caught my attention, seeping through the cracks in the walls, bathing the clearing in an eerie, unnatural glow. I approached the cabin cautiously, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of pine needles underfoot. The closer I got, the stronger the feeling of dread that settled in my gut. I reached for the door, and just as my fingers brushed the handle, I heard it. A voice faint and distant, yet unmistakable. "Help me!" The words were barely a whisper, carried on the wind, but they froze me in place. My hand hovered over the door, and for a moment, I considered turning back. But something inside me refused to leave. I pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the stillness. The inside of the cabin was even worse than the outside. The walls were covered in dark, dried stains, and the floor was littered with debris. But it was the air that struck me the most. It was thick with the stench of decay, so overpowering that it made my eyes water. Then I saw her. A figure huddled in the corner, her clothes tattered, her hair matted with dirt and blood. She looked up as I entered, her eyes wide with terror, her lips trembling as she tried to speak. "Please, you have to leave, before it comes back." Before I could react, the light in the cabin flickered and dimmed, and I felt a presence behind me. Cold, malevolent, like a shadow creeping into my soul. The woman's eyes grew even wider, and she screamed. A blood-curdling scream that echoed through the trees, sending birds scattering into the night. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just darkness, deep and impenetrable. The light was gone, and with it, any sense of direction. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, every instinct screaming at me to run. But before I could move, I felt it. A cold hand on my shoulder, fingers digging into my flesh, holding me in place. I don't remember how I escaped the woods that night. My next memory is of waking up in my bed, drenched in sweat, my body aching as if I'd run for miles. But the fear, that stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. The next day, I tried to tell the townsfolk what had happened, but they wouldn't listen. They refused to even acknowledge the cabin's existence, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes filled with the same terror I'd seen in that woman's eyes. It was as if the entire town was in on some horrible secret, a secret they were too afraid to confront. I've decided to leave Briar Hollow. There's something evil in those woods, something that feeds on fear and despair. But as I pack my things, I can't shake the feeling that it's too late. That whatever I encountered that night has already marked me, and no matter how far I run, I'll never be free. Help me!